The warm afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was a typical suburban day, with the sound of birds chirping and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Cars passed by in a steady stream, some slow, some fast, but all looking ordinary. A luxury car, however, caught the attention of a police officer as it slowed down and parked in front of a large, beautiful house. The officer, sitting in his patrol car, observed the car for a moment. He saw a woman inside. She was alone, dressed smartly, with her hair neatly styled. He didn't think much of it at first, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. This was an exclusive neighborhood, the kind of place where most people knew each other, and the idea that a black woman would live in a mansion like this seemed strange to him. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the situation triggered a sense of doubt in his mind. The officer, his curiosity piqued, decided to pull up behind the car. His decision wasn't based on any real suspicion, but more out of the assumption that something was off. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Maybe the car was parked too close to the curb or the woman looked out of place. As he got out of the patrol car, he couldn't shake the thought that something about this situation didn't add up. He walked up to the woman's car with his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun, just in case. His eyes scanned the woman as he approached, quickly noting her calm demeanor. There was no sign of distress, no hint of trouble. But for some reason that made him more suspicious. He hadn't seen her around before, and this was a neighborhood where people typically didn't just drive through unless they lived here. The woman had an air of confidence, but it didn't seem to match the environment he expected her to be in. She was too well-dressed, too put together for a neighborhood that was still mainly home to older white families. The officer leaned down to the window and tapped gently on the glass. The woman, noticing him, smiled politely and rolled down her window. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice calm and collected. "Good afternoon," he began, his tone slightly formal. "I'm just making sure everything is in order. You seem to be parked here for a while. This is a private neighborhood, and I haven't seen you around before." The woman raised an eyebrow, but she didn't show any sign of panic. She simply replied, "I live here, actually." The officer, though polite, had trouble believing her. "You live here?" he repeated, a little skeptical. "I see. And which house is yours?" The woman smiled again, her gaze steady as she gestured to the mansion they were parked in front of. "That one," she said confidently, pointing toward the large home with its white pillars and manicured lawn. "I own it." The officer paused, his gaze shifting from the woman to the house. He wasn't sure what to think. He had seen the same house before, but he'd never seen a black woman there. It just didn't seem right in his mind, even though he didn't consciously realize it. He stood there for a moment, processing the situation, trying to figure out how this could be possible. Surely, a mistake had been made. But the calmness in the woman's voice was unshakable. She could sense the officer's hesitation, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew she had nothing to prove, yet here she was, caught in a strange moment. Would she have to convince him? Would he believe her, or would she face more questioning, simply because of the way she looked? This was going to be interesting, she thought. The officer stood there for a moment, his eyes shifting back and forth between the woman and the grand house behind her. He hadn't expected this. There was something about her, something about the way she spoke and looked, that didn't fit the image he had in his mind of who belonged in this neighborhood. He had seen plenty of families, mostly older white couples, living in these houses. The idea that a black woman could be the owner of such a property didn't seem to align with his expectations. His thoughts, clouded by his own biases, began to swirl. The officer's hesitation was clear, but he tried to maintain his professionalism. He cleared his throat, straightened up, and said, "I'm just making sure everything's in order, ma'am. This neighborhood's got a lot of high-end properties, and we like to keep an eye on things." The woman's expression remained calm, though she could sense the officer's doubts. She had been stopped before, but never for something like this. She had learned to navigate these moments with grace. Still, It stung that her presence seemed to make the officer uncomfortable. It wasn't her fault that society had long been conditioned to think of people in terms of stereotypes. She had worked hard to get where she was, and the house standing behind her was a testament to that. "I understand," she replied, her voice steady but with a hint of challenge. "But I assure you, I live here. I've been living here for years." The officer wasn't entirely convinced. He looked at the woman once more, then at the grand house, and then back at the woman. He couldn't reconcile the image of her, a woman of color, standing in front of a house like that. It just didn't seem to match what he had come to expect from this neighborhood. He took a small step back, still unsure, and asked, "Do you mind if I see some identification, just to confirm?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her patience beginning to wear thin. She had expected some level of scrutiny, but this was different. It wasn't just a simple check. It was as if her very presence here was being questioned. She reached for her purse, took out her ID, and handed it to the officer without hesitation. The officer glanced at the ID and then back at the woman, still processing what was happening. The name on the ID matched, but the idea of her living in this neighborhood seemed to clash with his expectations. It was hard for him to accept, almost as if the reality before him didn't fit into the neat little boxes he had always used to categorize people. He checked her ID again, just to make sure, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had been a police officer for years, and he had seen all kinds of things, but this didn't make sense to him. The woman was confident, composed, but that didn't erase the fact that he felt something deep inside telling him he was missing something important. "Everything checks out," the officer muttered, still feeling a bit uneasy. He had expected a mistake, or some reason to doubt her claim. But there it was in black and white. Her name, her address, the reality he didn't want to face. The woman watched as the officer continued to look at her ID, his confusion lingering. She felt a sense of satisfaction that her information was now in front of him, but it wasn't enough to erase the tension in the air. There was still that lingering question in the officer's mind, one that he hadn't yet figured out how to address. "Anything else, officer?" she asked, her tone now firmer, as if she was daring him to continue. The officer hesitated for a moment, his face slowly shifting from suspicion to something else, maybe a little embarrassment, or perhaps self-reflection. He didn't know exactly what to feel, but one thing was for sure. He had just been shown something he had been blind to for far too long. The officer stood there in silence for a few moments, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. He had always prided himself on being fair, on following protocol. But now, standing in front of this woman, he felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. It wasn't because of her. No, not at all. It was the realization that he had made an assumption based on appearances, and that assumption had been completely wrong. The woman, noticing his hesitation, didn't speak right away. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, and she knew what had just happened. The officer was now realizing that his doubts, based purely on the color of her skin, had been unfair. He had assumed she didn't belong here because of the stereotype he had carried with him. And now he was being confronted with the truth. "Is everything all right, officer?" she finally asked, her voice steady, though there was a subtle challenge behind her words. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let the situation slide without making him acknowledge the discomfort that was now hanging in the air. The officer, his face slightly flushed, looked up at her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice a little softer than before. "I didn't mean to doubt you." She gave him a small nod, her expression neutral but knowing. "It's okay. I understand you're just doing your job. But I think you can see now that I belong here just as much as anyone else." The officer took a deep breath, his mind still grappling with the situation. He had seen people from all walks of life before, but he had never stopped to question the biases that shaped his worldview. Now, standing in front of her, he realized just how deep those biases ran. He glanced at the house again, still processing the fact that she was the owner. His eyes lingered on the property, its manicured lawn, the large windows, the sense of quiet wealth that the house exuded. He hadn't thought for a second that someone like her would own it, but now, with the evidence right in front of him, he could no longer deny the reality. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were trying to understand something deeper than just the logistics of the situation. 5 years, she replied, her tone calm, but there was a hint of something more. "I worked hard to get here, officer. I didn't just wake up one day and find myself in a house like this. It took years of hard work, dedication, and a lot of sacrifice." The officer nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He had heard similar stories before, but this was different. There was something in the way she spoke, something that made him feel the weight of his own ignorance. He had judged her based on a single characteristic, her race, and that judgment had led him to assume she didn't belong. But now he was confronted with the fact that he was wrong. He had misjudged her, and it stung to realize how easily he had fallen into that trap. She wasn't just any woman standing before him. She was someone who had earned her place in the world, someone who had fought against the odds to make something of herself. And yet, in that moment, the officer had treated her as if she were out of place. His assumptions had almost cost him the chance to learn something important. "I'm really sorry," the officer said again, his words sincere. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." The woman looked at him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "But it's not just about the apology. It's about changing the way we think, the way we see others. I hope that this will make you stop and think the next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs in a place like this." The officer nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. He hadn't expected this kind of conversation, but it was one he would never forget. The officer stood there, still processing the woman's words. They lingered in the air, settling over him like a weight he hadn't been prepared to carry. He had always thought of himself as someone who didn't judge people, someone who followed the rules and did his job without letting personal biases interfere. But standing in front of her now, he realized just how wrong he had been. It wasn't about following the rules. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about seeing people as individuals rather than grouping them based on preconceived ideas. "I never meant to treat you differently," the officer said, his voice quieter now. He felt a little embarrassed, but more than that, he felt something else, an unfamiliar mix of humility and understanding. He had been forced to confront his own assumptions, and it was uncomfortable. It made him feel exposed, as though he had been walking through life with his eyes closed, not seeing the world for what it really was. The woman, still standing with calm grace, nodded slightly. She could see that the officer was genuinely trying to make amends. It wasn't often that people admitted their mistakes, especially not in such a direct way. She appreciated his apology, but more than that, she hoped that this moment would be a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for others who might be caught in similar situations. "I get it," she said softly. "It's not easy to see beyond what you've been taught, what you've always known. But you have to understand, it's not just about me. It's about everyone who gets overlooked, ignored, or assumed to be something they're not simply because of the way they look." The officer looked down at the ground for a moment, reflecting on her words. He had been part of a system that, in many ways, reinforced those very same stereotypes. He had seen it play out over and over again, people being judged based on their race, their class, their background. But now that he was on the other side of it, he saw how damaging it could be. He felt the weight of her words pressing into his conscience, urging him to confront the discomfort he had been avoiding for so long. "How do you handle it?" he asked, looking up at her again, his curiosity piqued. "How do you keep going when people doubt you, when they look at you and see something different from who you really are?" The woman took a deep breath, her eyes thoughtful. "It's not easy," she said. "There are days when it feels like the world is set against you, when people won't even give you a chance because they've already decided who you are. But that's when you have to dig deep. You have to remind yourself that you're not defined by what others think of you. You are who you choose to be. and you have to fight for that every single day." The officer nodded, slowly absorbing her words. He had seen people face challenges before, but hearing it from her, from someone who had clearly overcome so much, made him see things differently. It wasn't just about following the law or keeping the peace. It was about understanding the human experience, about seeing people not as stereotypes, but as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "It's not enough to just do my job. I need to be more aware of the way I see people, the way I treat them. I can't let my assumptions get in the way of that." The woman smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for," she said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them, and how we treat others moving forward." The officer took a deep breath, feeling as though something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about how he would approach the world from now on. He realized that his job was more than just enforcing the law. It was about serving and protecting people, no matter who they were, no matter where they came from. And that meant challenging his own biases, breaking down the walls that had been built up over time, and seeing people for who they truly were. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense that he was on the right path, even if it had started with a mistake. And he knew that this encounter, this conversation, would stay with him for a long time. The officer stood there, still processing everything that had happened. The woman's words echoed in his mind, the weight of them pressing down on him with more force than he expected. He had never truly considered how deeply his assumptions had shaped his actions. It was one of those moments that forced you to look inward, to confront your own biases, and realize how they had impacted your interactions with others. For a long time, he had prided himself on being professional, on following the rules and doing his job with integrity. But in this moment, standing in front of the woman who had graciously accepted his apology, he understood that his job wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about people, about seeing them for who they were and not making snap judgments based on how they looked or where they came from. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the discomfort he felt. It wasn't easy. There was a part of him that wanted to walk away from this situation, to pretend like it hadn't happened. But he knew that was the easy way out. He couldn't just ignore the lesson that was unfolding before him. This was a chance for growth, for change, not just for him, but for the way he would approach his work from now on. "I've been thinking about what you said," the officer began, his voice softer now. "I've spent so much of my life doing things a certain way, seeing things a certain way, and I never really questioned it. I never really took the time to think about how my assumptions shaped my actions." The woman nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. She had seen this before, the moment when someone finally recognized their own limitations, their own biases. It wasn't easy, but it was the first step toward change. She had been in situations like this herself, where others had underestimated her or questioned her simply because of how she looked. But she had learned to use those moments as opportunities to educate, to challenge others to see things differently. "That's the hard part," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Recognizing that your actions are shaped by things you didn't even realize. But it's also the most important part, because once you realize that, you can start to make a change. You can start to see people for who they really are, not just the assumptions you've been taught to make about them." The officer nodded again, his eyes focused on the ground. He wasn't sure what to say next. What could he say? How could he make up for the way he had treated her in the beginning, the way he had questioned her simply because she didn't fit the image he had in his head? Words felt empty now, like a poor substitute for the realization that was beginning to sink in. "I know this sounds cliché, but I really never thought about it that way," he said finally, looking up at her. "I always thought I was just doing my job, but now I see that I was letting my own judgments get in the way of doing it right." She smiled, a small but knowing smile. "It's not too late," she said. "You can change, and it's not just about this moment. It's about every day, Every interaction you have from now on. You have the power to make a difference, to treat people with respect and fairness. It's about seeing people as individuals, not as the stereotypes we've been taught to believe. The officer felt a sense of relief wash over him, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that this wasn't going to be a simple fix. It wasn't going to be easy to change his mindset, to undo years of ingrained thinking. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to try. He felt determined to do better, to be better, not just for himself, but for the people he interacted with every day. "I promise," he said, his voice steady now. "I'll do better. I'll take this with me and make sure I don't make the same mistake again." The woman nodded, satisfied. That's all anyone can ask for. Just keep growing, keep learning, and keep seeing people for who they truly are. With that, the officer gave her a final nod of respect. He knew he had a long road ahead, but at least now he was on the right path. As he turned to leave, he felt a new sense of clarity, something he hadn't expected to find in this unexpected encounter. As the officer walked back to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. His steps were slower than usual, as if he was still processing everything that had just happened. He had stopped to question her, assuming she didn't belong in that neighborhood, and in doing so, he had almost missed the chance to learn something important. It was humbling to realize how his own assumptions had led him down the wrong path. But now, with every step toward his car, he felt a little lighter. The discomfort that had weighed on him just moments before was beginning to fade, replaced by a new sense of awareness. He had always been quick to follow the rules, but he now understood that following the rules wasn't enough. It was about understanding the people he was sworn to protect, about seeing them as individuals, not just faceless figures who fit into predetermined boxes. As he sat back in his patrol car, he took a moment to reflect on the woman's words. She had been so calm, so poised, despite the way he had treated her. Her grace in the face of his misjudgment spoke volumes. He thought about how she had spoken of her experiences, how she had faced prejudice, how she had fought against the odds to achieve what she had. She had made him realize how often people were judged by the way they looked, by the assumptions others made about them. It made him think about his own behavior, about how often he had fallen into that same trap. The officer sat there for a few more moments, just thinking, not sure what he expected to happen next. The woman had said that it wasn't just about the apology. It was about changing the way we think and see others. He knew that wasn't going to be something that happened overnight, but he also knew it was something he needed to work on. He thought about the people he had come across in his career. How many times had he treated someone with suspicion based on their appearance or where they lived? How many times had he let his own biases shape his actions without even realizing it? The answer was more than he cared to admit. The reality was that he had been part of a system that often overlooked people, assuming they didn't belong, assuming they weren't deserving of respect or equal treatment. The officer sighed, staring out of the car window. The world around him seemed the same, but to him, everything felt different now. He realized that every person he met from this point on was an opportunity to change. He didn't need to act out of suspicion or fear. He could listen, understand, and see people for who they really were. After a while, he started the engine of the patrol car and drove away from the scene. His mind was still swirling with thoughts, but there was a sense of purpose in his heart that wasn't there before. He wasn't just a law enforcer anymore. He was a person who needed to constantly learn, to push beyond the biases he had been raised with. It wasn't going to be easy, but he felt ready to face it. The officer knew that the next time he encountered someone, he would do better. He would take the time to listen, to see beyond appearances, and to treat people with the respect they deserved. And with each new encounter, he would grow. It wasn't just about doing the job. It was about doing it right. About making the world just a little bit better, one person at a time. As he left the neighborhood, he couldn't help but think back to the woman, her calmness, and her quiet strength. She had taught him more in that brief encounter than he could have ever expected. He wouldn't forget it. The officer drove through the streets, the sounds of his car humming steadily in the background as his thoughts continued to swirl. He had always prided himself on doing his job well, but today he had been forced to face something he hadn't expected: his own biases. It was a sobering realization, one that felt almost surreal. But it wasn't just about the mistake he had made. It was about the opportunity for change that had been presented to him. He knew he had to learn from what had happened, but that was just the beginning. The woman he had stopped had said something that resonated with him deeply. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about making a change in the way he saw people. It wasn't something he could forget after a single conversation, something that could just be brushed away. No, it was something that required consistent effort, something he had to remind himself of each time he interacted with someone. It meant challenging everything he had believed to be true, questioning the way he had been raised to think, and becoming more aware of how his actions affected others. As the officer made his way through the neighborhood, he thought about his interactions with people in the past. He wondered how many times he had made snap judgments, assuming that someone didn't belong based on how they looked or where they came from. It wasn't something he had always been conscious of, but now that it had been brought to light, it felt impossible to ignore. He turned onto a quieter road, the familiar surroundings now seeming different to him. It was like a veil had been lifted, and he was seeing everything through new eyes. The houses, the people he passed on the street, the families gathered in their yards. It all felt different now. He couldn't just go back to the way things were. His perspective had shifted, and now he had to take responsibility for that shift. The officer knew that change wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and constant self-reflection. But for the first time, he felt like he was ready to put in that effort. It wasn't just about understanding his own biases. It was about actively working to overcome them. It meant being more intentional about the way he treated others, especially those who didn't fit the image of what he thought people should be. He realized that by acknowledging his own mistakes, he was opening himself up to growth. The woman had made him see something he had never fully understood before. She hadn't just accepted his apology. She had helped him realize that everyone deserved to be seen for who they truly were, not for the assumptions that others placed on them. It was a powerful lesson, and he knew he couldn't let it slip away. When he finally reached the end of his shift, the officer was exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. It wasn't the kind that came from physical work, but from the emotional toll of confronting his own shortcomings. As he parked the car and walked toward the station, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward the woman he had met. She had taught him more than just a lesson in humility. She had shown him what it meant to truly see others, to look beyond the surface and understand the person inside. The officer knew that this encounter would stay with him, shaping his future actions and decisions. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was an opportunity to grow, to become better. And he was determined to make the most of it. He wasn't perfect, and he knew that he would stumble along the way. But as he walked through the door of the station, he had a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to doing better, not just as an officer, but as a person. And in that moment, he realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. As the days went by, the officer found himself reflecting on that encounter more and more. It had been a turning point for him, a moment when he was forced to confront his own biases and recognize the way his assumptions had shaped his actions. But it wasn't just a lesson learned. It was a process that would take time, effort, and commitment. He knew that the work of self-improvement wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a continuous journey, one that he had to choose to stay on every single day. The officer's interactions with people became different after that day. He became more aware of his reactions, more conscious of the way he looked at others. When he saw someone in need of assistance or stopped someone for a routine check, he tried to approach the situation with an open mind, without relying on preconceived ideas. He made a point of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. He realized that each person was unique, with their own story, and that it wasn't for him to decide whether they belonged based on how they looked. His colleagues noticed a change in him. At first, they thought it was just a phase, but as time went on, it became clear that he was genuinely trying to change. He listened more, spoke less, and showed a level of patience he hadn't demonstrated before. He took the time to understand people, to ask the right questions, and to be more thoughtful in his responses. And slowly, he gained their respect, not just as a police officer, but as a person who had grown. One day, while he was on duty, he came across a woman who reminded him of the one he had stopped months ago. She was walking down the street, her shoulders set with purpose, but there was a weariness to her steps. She seemed familiar, not because of her appearance, but because something about her presence made him pause. He approached her cautiously but kindly, offering his assistance. "Is there anything I can help you with?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with genuine concern. The woman looked up at him, surprised by his approach. She didn't expect a police officer to stop her with such a kind tone. It was clear that she had been through some struggles, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. "I'm just walking," she said, her voice soft. "I'm all right. Thank you." The officer nodded, offering her a smile before continuing on his way. But this time, he didn't just move on. He paused and realized that the encounter reminded him of how far he had come. He didn't feel the urge to judge her, to assume anything about her based on what he saw. He simply saw her as a person, someone who might be going through something, someone who deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. This moment, though small, felt significant. It was proof to him that the lessons he had learned were sinking in, that he was truly becoming the kind of person who could treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or appearance. It wasn't always easy, and there would still be moments of doubt or mistakes along the way. But he felt more confident than ever that the path he was on was the right one. As time passed, he continued to grow. He made more conscious efforts to see beyond the surface, to challenge the assumptions he had held for so long. He knew that every encounter, every interaction, was an opportunity to do better, to be better. And he was determined to keep learning, to keep improving, and to continue treating every person he met with the fairness and respect they deserved. Looking back, the officer realized that his meeting with the woman had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been a pivotal moment that had changed his perspective on the world and on himself. He was no longer the same officer who had made that quick, biased judgment. He was someone who understood that true growth came from within, from recognizing your mistakes and choosing to do better. And as he continued on his journey, he carried that lesson with him. One that reminded him that the world was full of people with their own stories, and that the only way to truly understand them was to listen, to be open, and to see them for who they really were.